Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Jessica Pavone, a composer and violist based in Queens, New York, whose new album Clamour is out now on Out of Your Head Records. Jessica's music, particularly in the ensemble context, always gives me such vivid images. She really mindfully situates sounds within space in a way that you can visualize these lines running between the instruments, forming these almost geometric patterns that are rippling with the rhythmic instructions delivered upon Jessica's scores. She talks in this interview about finding pitch to be a particular challenge when composing, in contrast to rhythm, which sounds like it's more effortless for her to work with rhythm. So with pitch, it does feel more shapely. It's more a case of like higher and lower than it is about any kind of melodic drive. She generates these circumstances in which the instruments all reside and flick between different patterns, the sides kind of sloping and shifting. It's beautiful. I mean, these 4 pieces take their names from inventions by women throughout history to circumvent obstructions to their freedoms. And these pieces feel like inventions. There's a real mechanical sensibility to how the instruments interact with each other. Like they're generating some kind of archaic machine of pulleys and ropes. It's wonderful. This conversation was great. Jessica has a very distinctive relationship with listening that we get into throughout this conversation, and picked 3 cool records too. So if you're enjoying Crucial Listening, you can support it over at ko-fi.com/crucial listening. Any amount you please, one-off or monthly. And if you're just listening and enjoying, thank you so much. Okay, without any further ramble from myself, this is Jessica Pavone on Crucial Listening. Hello, Jessica. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hi.
Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. So you're here to talk about 3 important albums. Before we get to those, I want to talk about your new album, Clamour, which came out recently on Out of Your Head Records. So the 4 movements of this album take their titles from inventions by women that were utilized to circumvent obstructions to their freedoms. And I've seen you write and heard you talk, in fact, in a couple of places about the process of researching this. So at what point did it feel like that was something that you wanted to do to kind of accompany your process of digging into this?
Sure. Well, I wrote the first movement. I knew I wanted to write for strings, a piece for strings, and for Katie, who plays bassoon. And I knew I wanted the format to be 4 movements, and the first and last movement were going to be just strings, and the 2 middle movements would feature Katie, because I had written a piece with a similar format a couple of years ago with string ensemble and soloists, and I kind of wanted to follow that format. And so when I started writing the first movement, I had no idea, as you never do. You don't really know what's going to happen. And I sat down at the piano. I came up with a couple of notes that I wanted to work with, and I started to come up with the form of the piece. And in the middle of that movement, there's this kind of back and forth seesaw rhythm that started to evolve. So some phrases were 8 bars long and some phrases were 9 bars long, and I was just working with this back and forth seesaw rhythm. And when I was finishing the piece, I was starting to just think about the seesaw. And I wasn't even thinking of the rhythm as a seesaw. I was just thinking of it as this back and forth rhythm that had evolved. And so I started just researching the origins of the seesaw. And that's something that's just interesting to me anyway, is where do things originate from? Like, who was the first person to think of this, or where? And so what I discovered is that, like many things, the seesaw was kind of simultaneously invented all over the world, you know? Like there was a seesaw in Scandinavia, there was a seesaw in Korea. So I just started seeing like all of these origins of the seesaw. So it's like, oh, that's interesting that all of these different cultures came up with a seesaw. And what I learned about the Korean seesaw is that women invented it. I can't remember what century because this research was done a while ago. Because they were not allowed to leave like the walls of their property. And so they invented this seesaw. It's a standing seesaw, and it's like a competitive sport, I think now. It's like not an easy thing to do, to be standing up and going back and forth on a seesaw. And you can see YouTube videos of it. It seems quite challenging. But the reason they invented it is because they wanted to see beyond the walls of their property, because they weren't allowed to leave. And they wanted to see like what was going on in the town. And I did read somewhere they wanted to see if their husbands were cheating on them. But this was just like women who were, married. It was, they were not allowed to leave. So that's how they just looked out into the town. So I thought that was interesting. I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I kind of wanted to title the movement after that. And I had to think about it for a while. And then I just thought that it would be interesting if all of the pieces were titled after similar inventions. So that's when I started trying to find more information, which took me most of the year. It was like I worked on the piece off and on. I started it in January. Started the piece that was in January. And I didn't pick it up again until the summer because I had no means actually to produce the piece. And so I just happened to be in January. I was at a residency and I knew I wanted to write this piece. And I was like, well, I have these 3 weeks to work on music. I guess I'll start this piece, even though I know that there's no way that I can produce it because I had no funding. So I wrote that movement and then I kind of left it. And then in the summer, I figured out a way that I was going to be able to premiere the piece in the fall. So I was like, okay, I have to finish this piece in the next couple months. And that's when I really started to research the other movements. But in that time between January and the summer, I thought about, oh, that would be cool if I could find other inventions like that. So it had been kind of like mulling around in my brain throughout the year.
One thing I heard you talk about in another conversation was rehearsals. It sounds like a very interesting time when you bring these pieces in for rehearsal and you start to get in dialogue with the players that you're working with. What are your memories of bringing this selection of pieces in for the first time and getting people familiar with it? Like, what was that experience like? What was the kind of feedback you were getting? Take me through that a bit.
Sure. So, there's 6 string players, and then there's Katie who's playing bassoon. And we all live in New York, and Katie lives in Atlanta. So how I structured the rehearsals, our premiere was to be in the middle of November. So in October, I did a rehearsal with just the string players. And then in November, because Katie came to town, we had to do it all in that week. We did 2 rehearsals with Katie and then the performance. So in the October rehearsal, we primarily focused on the 2 movements that just featured the string players, which was the first and the last movement. And then the second rehearsal, which was with Katie, we just focused on her movements. And then the last rehearsal, we focused on the entire piece. But I do work with the same musicians as much as I can. I've found a group of string players that I really like working with. And because there's fluidity in the system in which I write, they have an understanding of that. And they also, a lot of times, will give me feedback and input as to ways that they think some of the things I'm trying to communicate could be more effective, because I'm not always working with traditional notation and I'm trying to communicate things that aren't, sometimes I am, but not always, that aren't necessarily, I'm kind of inventing ways to write to communicate what I want in a way so I could kind of say I want there to be this element of freedom, but I need to use notation in a way so that somebody else will understand it. And sometimes they will just have opinions about like a certain sound world that we're in, and they'll say, oh, what if we stay in this sound world a little bit longer? Or when we're actually physically playing these sort of some of the extended techniques that I'm coming up with, we'll physically be doing it and be like, oh, this might make more sense if we try it this way. So they do give feedback, and it's always helpful. And then when Katie came into the rehearsals, Katie's also a composer, and she had a lot of great, and most of what Katie's insight and opinions was like, let's stay in this section longer. Because I think for me, sometimes I try to rush through things because I don't want to, I like to be in a stasis of sound, but I'm always concerned with like boring the listener or like, and Katie was really good at being like, Pavone, this sound you're working with here works. Like, let's just stay in it for a little longer. So a lot of what happened too in the rehearsal is because I use time-based scores, not always, but quite often. So there's like a clock and we're in a particular measure for a while. And we ended up changing a lot of the times because I don't know what it's going to sound like until it's not like I can just put the finale playback on and get a MIDI version of what I'm doing.
Right,
So a lot of what we altered in the rehearsals was the times for how long we stayed in certain sections and the amount of intensity certain sections had,
While we're talking about the structure of the piece, my final question on Clamor is actually about the ending. I'm learning that I really like the way that you end your records. I mean, there's a couple that I've heard, I think kind of this one included really, where it sort of feels like it's ending on like an arm outstretched. It's sort of just like heading somewhere as it's coming to a conclusion. At least that's how it's hitting me. And it's like a really wonderful feeling because, you feel the vigor of that as it comes to a close. But yeah, how easy do you find it to conclude your records, or is there a way that you kind of approach that?
I'm curious what other records, if you can recall what other records in particular you're thinking.
Lull, I was listening to Lull today and I had the very, very similar sensation on that one too.
Okay.
Yeah, there's something that felt kind of hung about the way that it comes to a close, which felt very satisfying. Yeah.
Well, I do feel like when I'm writing, pitch is the thing that's the most difficult for me. I can come up with rhythmic structures and cycles very easily, and pitch is the hardest thing for me. And I try to, how do I choose chords that aren't obvious, or how do I choose chords that aren't chords? So like I have the hardest time deciding on pitches.
Right.
So a lot of times I'll give players like pitches to alternate with. So like I'm not even choosing the chord. But I do know, I can remember exactly how Clamor ends. We're playing metered music at 120. I remember we're doing something at 60 and then it double times to 120. I mean, that one I chose to end. There's such an ambiguous floating happening in the middle of Bloom. And so I decided to end in meter so that it was like concisive, but it sounds like what you're picking up on is the pitch material that I'm using. From what I remember is I think it's a non-resolving chord, but there's no key to resolve to because I don't write in keys.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So my relationship to pitch is really complicated. I ignore keys, although yet I do think of chords, but I think of more just like how open a chord is. Like I'll think of if notes happen to fit into a chord, I kind of like them to be as spaced out from each other. So like think of like a ninth chord, but like the root is 3 octaves lower, that's kind of how I think of like covering a large, not always, but you can do that when you have bass and violin in the same ensemble. So I'm more thinking about how much space the chord is taking up. And I will, there are chords there, but I'll invert them in such a way that they're kind of unrecognizable. And I am working at the ending of that piece. I think it ends in consonants, but I am throwing quarter tones in a lot of the writing as well, especially in Bloom. So that kind of puts everything off kilter. Lull, I can't exactly remember how it ends.
No, you know I can't recall it now. It's just funny. I felt the same or a similar kind of feeling come back in as it came to a close.
Yeah, it's probably
nice.
me like knowing there needs to be a conclusion, but not wanting there to be like a cadence. Yeah.
That's great. Oh, I love it. Well, like I say, Clamor is fabulous. I will include a link in the show notes so people can check it out, and please do. So, Jessica, let's go to your important records now. One question I like to ask at this point is how you thought about the word important when picking your list. So was there a way that you understood the word important in order to come up with the list that you did?
I thought of records that I could listen to 700 times and never get sick of, and I probably have listened to 700. And also the 3 records that I mentioned, I don't even really listen to them so much anymore, but there were periods of my life where like that's all I could listen to. And when I discovered them, especially 2 of them, when I discovered them, I could only listen to them for the longest time. But then also I do think that there's something about those records that informs how I like to create music. So I do think it's like record, because I mean, there's also like tons of pop records that I like that I listen to, but I don't think that they influence my work in quite the same way as these pieces have.
All right. So let's go for your first important record. I don't know if you had an order in mind, but yeah, tell me the name of your first important record and a bit about why it's important to you as well.
Okay, well, I remember the 3 that I told you, so I'll just give them in the order that I discovered them. Obviously, like this one, the first one's obvious. Like I discovered this one first because it's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a really important piece for me, especially since I'm a string player who I don't play classical music. I don't identify with classical. I just don't. When you play a string instrument, you grow up playing that repertoire, and I was always in the position where I was playing this music, but I didn't identify with it. But I always, for some reason, resonated with Beethoven. And it took me probably not until I was in college when I realized, because I grew up playing string instrument, and then I went to a conservatory where that's all you do is play classical music, and I was like, I really don't like this. But I don't think I realized it until then. I just thought I was just like playing what my teacher was telling me to play. But the Ninth Symphony in particular, like I have a book of the score. I've literally have sat down and listened to that piece with the score multiple times. I'm just like obsessed with the way that piece sounds. And I think, I don't know what it is. I have some kind of kindred spiritual thing with Beethoven. I think part of it with that piece, you can almost like hear his schizophrenia in that piece. He changes moods so quickly. Like it's just he's just kind of all over the place. He's like dancing with this idea of being like kind of all over the place in that piece. I can never hear it and be like, oh, I'm sick of this piece.
That's so interesting. So this is the one, or
it's like the most traditional piece I would ever probably identify as an influence.
Wow. So when was this really hitting for you? How old were you when you were really into this piece?
Well, I remember my senior year of college, we did this piece, and I played in the orchestra and I was in the choir, because that semester I had to take choir for some reason. So when we did the concert, I played in the orchestra, but I was going to the choir rehearsals, so I was like completely enmeshed in this piece. But I don't even think it was till after that. I kind of feel like it was sometime in my 30s or something where I got my hand on the score and I really just started listening to it a lot. And yeah, just realized like how much it has stuck with me. Although kind of all of his symphonies. And when I think back on it, when I was in orchestra in college, like I never really was that interested in the music, but whenever there was like a Beethoven symphony, I was like into it. I don't know why. I just like his music. And yeah, somebody gave me a book of the score, maybe like for my birthday one year. I can't remember. And then I just started reading the score. Yeah.
Wow. Do you have many memories of what it was like to play this piece? I mean, I have literally no experience with playing classical music. So, I mean, is it challenging, or what does it feel like to actually play this piece?
I have more memories of this particular piece. I have more memories listening to it than playing it.
Right.
My memories of playing in orchestra is always just feeling like, can I keep up? Am I doing this right? What am I doing?
Right.
There were some, I part of why I became a composer, like in hindsight, when I think about it, I really didn't like going to music school. I didn't know what it was going to be like. I went to music school, and so much of being a viola player in music school, and they put you in the classical tradition, at least that's the track I was in, is being told everything you're doing wrong. Like there's only one way to play this, and I was never good at like articulation or interpretation, and just constantly being told what you're doing is wrong. And I was like, well, if I write my own music, I'm basically inventing it, and nobody could tell me it's wrong. I think it was like so many years of just feeling like everything I was doing was wrong. So my experience of what I remember playing in the orchestra was like hiding out in the back of the viola section, like not wanting anyone to realize, like, am I playing out of tune? Like, what am I just thinking like, I felt like everybody here knows what's going on but me. Right. And I've always felt that way. Even when I was like in high school and I would play in like the county orchestras, I was always like in the back of the section, just so self-conscious, like, did I play a note out of tune and everyone can hear it? It was mostly just terrifying. Yeah.
I've heard you talk about composing and relating to performers for whom you're composing in a way which feels very nourishing and nice. So I'm wondering whether that's a response to that feeling. Like I've heard you talk about wanting performers not to feel stressed and to feel like the music for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it, why does this have to be, I mean, also playing a string instrument, it just can be painful. Why does this have to hurt? Why does this have to be so technically challenging? Like, I'm not into the dexterity. You just need, I don't know, the jockery that kind of comes with, I mean, I think technique is good, but yeah, I'm sure it's all a reaction to how I felt learning to play music.
With this Beethoven symphony then, I mean, I don't know whether this is a fair question given how intimately you relate to the whole thing, but are there particular sections that strike you or that really connect with you throughout this piece?
The beginning of the first movement.
Right.
You know, it's like super quiet and then it's super loud and super quiet, just like kind of, definitely the first movement. I'd say the first movement and probably the last movement. Yeah. And the third movement. I mean, the third movement's so different. Yeah.
Yeah. There's I've never listened to this all the way through ever. And then there's a point. It's the weirdest chord that gets thrown in, and I think it's about 50 minutes in, maybe just after the Ode to Joy bit, but it kind of concludes that movement. I don't know if you know the one I'm talking about, but it's loud and prolonged. He's
almost like he's really angry.
Yeah, it's such a strange chord for almost.
I think a lot of that piece is very strange for the time. And that's another thing. I think he's just being so genuine. He's also deaf. He's about to die, probably frustrated, pissed off, totally crazy. And somehow he actually, I think, conveys it in the piece.
And you mentioned that these records inform how you approach your music. So what does that look like with Symphony No. 9?
Well, the one time I did write an orchestra piece, I started with a D minor chord. So, and that actually was by accident. I was writing an orchestra piece back in 2015, and I, again, was like trying to come up with what's like the biggest, widest chord I can start this with. And I came up with this chord, and I was like, oh, I like that chord. And I was like, I don't even think about chords. I just pick a bunch of notes, and then I'll be like, okay, I like these notes together. And then I'll write them down on the paper and be like, oh, that's just a D minor 7 chord, you know? And then I was just like, wait a minute. This chord sounds familiar. And then I looked at the Beethoven score. I was like, oh, it's the same score. I mean, it's the same chord. Wasn't planning it. I was like, okay, I'm sticking with this. So I literally just went to the piano and just played some notes. And I was like, this is how I'm going to start. I do that quite often. And it happened to be, I think, a D minor 7 or a D minor 9. And then I was like, okay, that's a sign. This is where we're starting. But then also I do kind of reference like the 3/4 a little bit. that he like from the third movement.
Mm.
But that's the only, I mean, I don't really think the way he writes influences the way I write in particular, except for I think that I just love how you can just feel him through the music. It seems like it just comes with somebody being so genuine with what they're doing, I think.
So, Jessica, let's go to your second important record now. So, again, if you could give me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important to you too.
It's John Cage String Quartet in 4 parts, 1949. That record blew my mind when I first heard it. I remember exactly when I heard it. I was in my early 20s, and I was living in the East Village at the time, and the interlibrary loan, because the interlibrary loan in New York, you can interlibrary loan in the borough that you live in. And so I was able to get music from the Performing Arts Library, which is over by Lincoln Center. So I was constantly just ordering CDs from the Performing Arts Library to my library and picking them up. I just remember like getting a stack of CDs, just whatever I could find. And so I just remember like coming home and putting that CD on, and I had never heard anything like it. Like the strings don't really sound like strings. They sound like flutes, kind of wooden flutes. I was like, what is this? And I think also like with Cage, he's known for all the chance music and all this stuff, but a lot of his like completely notated music that he was doing in the earlier years, I think is so mind blowing. This is just like, that was like just the beginning of me discovering and getting into it. But yeah, it just didn't sound like anything. And I actually since then have taken that score out of the library and tried to play along with it, and it's extremely difficult. There's a lot of there's a lot of harmonics that are hard to play, and because I wanted to understand like how he got this sound. I'm not sure if you know the piece at all.
Well, this Cage piece?
Yeah.
Yeah, I listened to it a couple of times today, and I saw as part of the score instruction, is it like that you avoid putting too much weight on the bow?
Yeah, I don't remember. I took this score out probably 15 years ago, so I don't remember the details of the score.
Right.
Yeah, I really don't remember the details. I haven't done anything like that in a long time. And I definitely think that piece influences how I write for strings, because I think I really try sometimes to make strings not sound like strings or not use vibrato, So I think that piece definitely more than the Beethoven Symphony influenced how I write music.
Cage as well said that he had no feel for harmony. There was this, also this sense that he was trying to find means of composing which I guess channeled that apathy towards harmony. I mean, from what you were saying about your relationship with pitch and chords, do you think that's another reason why you feel a connection to this one?
Probably, because I feel like he probably approaching that the same way. It's more like kind of getting a sound. But also they're really concise. I mean, they're very rhythmically pretty tight. It's written out. It's all written out. It's just the sound quality that he's getting out of the string players and out of the string instruments. I don't think I had ever heard before. So much associated with like strings is like this crazy vibrato. When I hear like when I hear like a classical violin, like with all, it's almost like it's like nails on a chalkboard to me. Like I can't even handle that sound anymore. It's really hard to deal with. And I don't see why that became it's kind of like opera singers. Like, why are you still singing like that? Like the reason they sang like that is because they didn't have microphones and you needed to project. It's like, give it a rest. I don't know. That's kind of how I feel about string instruments, and I feel like that cage piece really kind of nails it.
The ending of this one as well is really striking. Like, what do you make of the way this one ends? Like the last 2 minutes, kind of again felt a bit reminiscent of listening to your records in the sense that, you know, this one enters this phase and then after a minute and a half, it's just gone. But it's like this really jovial.
Yeah, and then there's like
part.
that one string that's like do-do-do, do-do-do. It almost sounds like it's like a flute or a fife like blowing over the whole thing. If I'm remembering, I haven't listened to this piece in a couple of years, so I'm trying to. All of these pieces that I told to you, I haven't listened to in a while, but I just know that they blew my mind. If I'm remembering correctly, it's like dun 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 dun. I'm not a good singer, but there's the strings are kind of doing this repetitious thing, and there's this one string that's kind of like above, and just kind of like they're doing like kind of an ostinato sort of, and it just ends. If I'm remembering that, if the movement I'm thinking of is the one that is the last one, which I can't recall right now. Oh yeah, there's no, again, it's just like, it's like the piece is over. There's no need for a cadence. There's no need for like a big elaborate anything. But it does end with like motion. It ends with motion for sure.
Yeah, because it sounded like, so for the predominant part of this piece, stillness and absence of motion seemed to be like a real driver of what, you know, Cage was going for, right?
And those are the parameters as opposed to like melody and harmony. And I think about that a lot in music. I'm not focused on melody and harmony. I'm thinking about parameters. Is it moving? Is it stasis, movement? There's so many other things that you can do with sound.
How do you relate to Cage outside of this piece? Like, do you connect with a lot of Cage's music?
I feel like the music of his that I resonate more with is the earlier composed music. I haven't listened to him in a while. There's some percussion music from that time. I feel like I like his notated music from like the 40s, maybe better than sometimes when there's, I mean, obviously when I first learned about Cage and what he was doing, my mind was blown because it was the, you know, when you're in college and you learn about 433, you're like, whoa, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't always grasp, like sometimes when it's just chants, I don't always grasp on, you know, it just doesn't. Conceptually, I find it brilliant, but it's not always something I want to listen to.
And this was this, you mentioned two of these that you really went in for and listened to over and over again. So this sounds like one of those, right?
For sure, yeah.
Over and over again, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say like a good, you know, I probably discovered this piece like 20 years ago, if not longer, and it was like huge for me back then. Like none of the pieces I mentioned to you are like new discoveries for me. They're ones that like I discovered a while ago and have sort of stood, you know, as pillars for me, you know. I guess I wasn't thinking about like what my contemporaries were. Yeah, I was thinking about, I guess the way I took the question was like, what are some things that like changed, they were all very pivotal to me. And not necessarily like, oh, this is a new album someone I know just released and it's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That tends to be the kind of direction that most people, I think, go in on this podcast, is like they end up reaching way back. And like, so, you know, teens and 20s come up quite a lot, which is really interesting. I mean, it's interesting as well, you say that, you know, with these two, at least, that you don't tend to revisit them. Is that standard for you? Do you tend to... I don't know. Do things stay where they were within time?
I have a very complicated relationship to listening to music. I'm always trying to like change that, but I very often will go a very long time and not listen to any music at all. And I think it's because a lot of time when I'm writing, I don't want to hear anything. So there's that. And then there is this thing where I hate deciding what to listen to. I find it very overwhelming.
Yeah.
So if I am listening to music, I will pick a record and I will listen to that record only for about like 3 weeks. I'll listen to the same record over and over again. And because I don't want to decide. I just hate to. I wish like there was someone in my house who just... I end up listening to the radio a lot.
Right.
Because the radio is going to decide for me.
Right, yeah.
I find it really hard. But I just rearranged my record player and my records so that they're more visible. And I'm trying to like... listen to them more, but I get overwhelmed by making the choice, and So a lot of times I just don't even listen to music, which is it's not the greatest, but I listen to less music. And I also feel like in this period I'm talking about, like in my early 20s when I was taking all these CDs out of the library, it's like I was still searching and trying to figure out what I was doing, and you're thirsty for I mean, I still need input, but I don't think as much as I did back then. I feel like I kind of know what I want to be doing, and I have a lot of my formulas in place, So it's, I think, a different time too. I definitely was checking out stuff when a lot of this was very new to me in a way that I don't checking out stuff isn't like the number one thing at this point in my life, although I do love to hear music.
I guess also as well, it's interesting to talk about the radio and the kind of relief of agency that brings, I suppose.
Yeah.
Back then, you had less agency than you do now to just pick anything. So, it was what was accessible, which at least acted as some kind of guiding principle to what you listen to. But I mean, I really like the sound of listening to the same record for 3 weeks. Is there something about that that's actually quite nice to dig into something that intimately?
Yeah, I love that, because then you really you start to hear things in it that you didn't hear before, and you just get to know it in a different way. And there's like something comforting about the familiarity of it, I think, too.
Talking about listening to something over and over again feels like a nice segue to the final important record that you picked, Jessica.
And this one, I have so many memories of being in the subway with my discman listening. There was literally like probably 6 months straight where I had like my discman I used to bring in the subway, and I listened to this CD on repeat in my discman, probably everywhere, in the train, walking. I don't know, I just was obsessed. And I actually discovered this CD around the same time I discovered the Cage piece. And it was in the same way. I took the CD out of the library. So this would have been over 20 years ago. I don't know that you can get CDs in Queens. I should look into that. Well, I guess things are different now with the streaming. I find the whole streaming thing is just overwhelming, because you can have access to anything that I don't even... I'd want to browse a catalog. It's too hard.
Exactly.
I want to browse something. Anyway, so this last piece, it was Terry Riley, You're No Good. Do you know that piece, or have you listened to it?
Yeah, well, I took it because when it came through, it mentioned it was You're No Good, featuring Harvey Avern, right? So I know there's a CD version that also has like a 60-minute piece on the other side. So I listened to this 20-minute piece, which is the one that you have the connection with.
I'm just thinking of that piece. There might have been another piece on there, and I just never listened to it. Because that's the other thing too, is I would rip the CDs from the like, you can't do that anymore. Like, you used to have like a CDRW, you could rip the CD from the library and you can listen to it. Like, I ripped all these. You can't do that anymore, but I guess you don't have to. I just so that, I think that there was 2 pieces on it, but I really just listened to that piece. And that one in particular, I mean, I also like really like soul music, so the fact that he's sampling a soul song, which is in a really good soul song, but then just also the form and the development of that piece, the more you listen to it, you can hear, like, it sounds like it's the beginning and the end is kind of more like this static and ambiguous, but there actually is like from what I remember and what I could feel is there's a cycle happening there that's predictable, of like where the blips are happening and where he's cutting. I don't know what the technical term is. And you really start to hear it if you listen to that piece over and over again.
Wow.
There's in the beginning and in the end, before, when he's not using the soul song, there's a repetitive sort of electronic sound that also I feel like is being manipulated, and there's like an underlining cycle happening as well.
Yeah.
For sure.
That is the weirdest transition
Yeah.
Because I didn't know anything about the piece before I listened to it. This is the first time I've been acquainted with it.
And did you only listen to it once?
No, I listened to it a couple of times, but I still found it really... there's something very visceral about the transition into the soul song, which feels... you almost feel like you're getting the bends from that movement, you know?
Yeah. There's that, and also going out of it, too. There's another whole... I don't know.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's what... Did you feel like you started to hear more the more you... Because also, it sounds like there's nothing going on. It sounds like this just sort of static thing, but the more you listen to it, there's something underneath. There's something... But did you, so like by the second or third time, did you hear more? Or did it still kind of feel the same way? I'm just curious. Because like I listened to that piece so many times that...
It felt like I started to really tune in to... It feels like almost like an appraisal of the texture of that soul song. And there's something about being released into it from that electronic beginning, which suddenly made me very aware of just the warmth and the energy of that soul music production. And it's the way as well, obviously, you know, you get certain sections which are repeated and diced up in such a way which augments the rhythm, but it felt to me less about the rhythm and more about how the rhythm illuminates different aspects of like the raw texture, like certain symbols or
and the phrasing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so as someone who's listened to it hundreds of times, what's your journey been like with this?
Well, again, I did listen to this song this piece last January, but before then I hadn't listened to it in a long time.
Right.
So my journey with it, meaning like how has it influenced me, or?
Well, in the same way that, you know, I've listened to it a couple, 3 times now, and my relationship with it is, you know, changing or different things are coming to light. Do you feel that progression take place over, you know, the hundreds of times that you've listened to it?
I think what's interesting about it, and when something that I just like in music in general, is when something is changing, but you don't even notice it's changing till it's something different. Which I think is an interesting technique, and I think this is kind of like the perfect example of that, you know. I mean, they're obvious. I'm more thinking of the lead in and the lead out. But even still, you would think, like, listening to a song chopped up, you'd think it would be like jarring or irritating, but like the way it's done, it doesn't bother me at all, you know. I could see someone listening to this and be like, just let me hear the song. But I don't feel that at all, because I think just the way it's edited, it's just I think there's some like rhythmic genius to whatever. I imagine, I don't know for sure, I imagine he deliberated on every decision. I feel like a lot of thought was put, because it sits so perfectly.
Well, the loops are very precise as well. Like, they're clearly not off the cuff. Like the rhythms are very exact. Yeah. Terry Riley. So are you into other Terry Riley works as well, or is this the one?
I've listened to other works of his, but none of them have resonated with me as much as this. But yeah, I would say aesthetically, like I like his music, but I feel like this one really stands out.
And is this another one where you feel how this has informed how you approach composing music?
I'm not sure if it's informed how I write. I definitely... I like the idea of working with limited materials and doing as much as you can with a little bit. And I think that he's kind of doing that here, or that's kind of what, in some ways, it is sort of an approach to minimalism. But I do definitely try to do as much as I can with as little as possible in some of, more so I think in my solo music. I think it's more apparent in my solo music, where I've like essentially have made 4 albums of solo music based on the notes of the open strings. And you think like, that's kind of insane. How can you come up with so many different things with the open strings? But somehow I managed to do it. And I think that there's a similar thing here where he's working with like not very much material, but doing something with it that's like striking.
And so is that the thing that makes it the important record? I think so.
I would say, yeah, maybe look at that compositional. It's a compositional approach, kind of like the Cage piece, where it's just based on a parameter. Maybe this one more so. It's just based on a couple of parameters.
Yeah, because there's something very interesting where, you know, these three records, derive from, say, like 15, 20 years ago, and there hasn't been, you know, this really strong inclination to listen to them, and yet, you know, for like a podcast like this, like they're the three records that come into your head. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as we're talking, I'm thinking of other pieces that really kind of have blown my mind, but not in the same way these have. And I wonder how much of it was like the age I was at when I heard them, you know, where I was at in my development.
Okay, Jessica, I've got one more question for you. What have you listened to recently? You say you don't always listen to too much music, but is there anything kind of in recent memory that's really stuck out for you, where you're like, okay, I really.
There are two things that have really stuck out. I'm thinking about things that I've heard on the radio that have blown my mind. Actually, three. But what I've been listening to lately, though, is the Moon Glows. It's like a old doo-wop band. It's like an old doo-wop band. Huh. But the Moon Glows record, I just rearranged like my whole record player and moved all my records to the other side of the apartment so that they were in. And that Moon Glows record kind of popped out, and I put it on, and for the last 3 days, that's all I've been listening to. And it's amazing. Wow. And that's a record. I haven't listened to this album in years, and I still know every single word. So that's like on rotation right now. But I can think of three pieces that, when I listen to WKCR, which is it's the Columbia University radio station in New York, and there are three pieces that have come on WKCR in recent years that when they came on, my mind was completely blown. Mm-hmm. One of them was a Joanna Bayer string quartet. I had never even heard of her, and now since I've done some research, and she's a composer from the 1930s, and then I have to look up the name. There's this Pharoah Sanders song that came with Pharoah. I gotta look it up. Pharoah Sanders. Okay, it's called Memories of Edith Johnson. It's on the Pharoah Sanders album called Pharaoh.
Okay.
Amazing. I've listened to the whole record, and I don't like the whole record as much as I like that one track. And the other thing was, it's Christopher Otto. It was a piece for 6 or 9 violins. Let me see. Christopher Otto is a violinist in the Jack Quartet, and they played his piece for 8 violins on WKCR one day, and I was just like blown away, completely blown away. So I would say those are 3 pieces of music recently.
What's going on in that 8 violins piece? What about it connected with you?
Well, just the sound is so bonkers. Kind of like the way when I heard that Cage piece, I was like, I've never heard something like this. It's 8 violins, and I think that they're going through speakers as well. It's like math. I think he has like a math background, so I think he works a lot with like the tones in between, you know. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like an alien. It sounds amazing. So many violins layered, and so many notes in between the tones. It just sounds crazy. It was another one of those things where I was like, I've never heard something like this.
Yeah, I'm going to have to dive into that.
Yeah.
So is that your radio station of choice?
Yeah. They have really good programming. It's Columbia University Public Broadcasting. Is that what it's called? Public Broadcasting? Public radio. Yeah, they have really good shows. I'm trying to think of what the names of the shows are. Okay, so there's Out to Lunch, which is like a jazz show at noon. There's, Bird Flight is the classic Phil Schaap, Charlie Parker show. But they do like new music in the afternoons. I can't remember the name of that show. There's a show on Saturday called Crossing 110th Street, which is like kind of soul and funk. I also listen to WFMU, which is another radio station out of New Jersey. But I tend to listen to WKCR more. Yeah. I kind of want someone else to make the decision, so. But I'm committed to start listening to my records again.
Nice. Jessica, thank you so much. I've loved talking about Clamour. I've loved talking about these important records and the additional recommendations that we managed to wedge in at the end as well. So thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
And to everyone listening, see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.